I've been working on this project for about 8 years and doing the walking tours for about three of them. And the Historical Society has been a huge partner, super supportive. And I really couldn't be doing any of this without them. So thanks again for inviting me tonight. I'm excited to share with you this topic. It is June in San Francisco. So it is like Christmas at the North Pole. This is the most festive time of the year to be here. And the topic for tonight couldn't be more appropriate. And I'll get started here. So the main reason I wanted to choose this topic is because we don't teach this history, sadly, at least not in grade school. If you want to learn a lot of this information, you're going to have to take a college course. You're going to have to do a lot of your own research, buy a lot of your own books in order to uncover this, maybe talk to a lot of locals in order to kind of find some of these places. And so it's really important that we do as much as we can to try and share this information, make it as accessible as possible. I always say when you come out of the closet, nobody hands you a gay history textbook. You have to figure it all out on your own. And what you often encounter is when you come out of the closet, you have a lot of questions. You might ask, why do we have a rainbow flag? Why do gays want to be in the military so badly? Why is gay marriage at the top of the docket of all of the things that we want? And why is San Francisco so freaking gay, right? So a lot of these questions come to mind, and we have to kind of dig a little bit to figure this out. So today, I hope that this lecture kind of inspires, hopefully, a better appreciation for our identity. For those of you that identify as queer, hopefully that gives you a better sense of belonging to a larger group of people. And that hopefully this draws a bit of connection to this amazing city we live in and the contributions it's been able to make to our history here. We're at a weird time where the queer community has a lot of threats, not just outside political ones that we probably are all aware of, but also within the community. There's a lot of conversations about what's the role of some of the gay spaces we used to have, the traditions, the customs, and what's their future. And so reflecting on history is a great way for us to better contextualize those conversations and push them in a forward direction here. So in order to kick this off tonight, basically, we're going to write that gay history textbook, and we're going to figure it out together. So we're going to start with a little bit of a primer on LGBTQ history. We're going to try to zip through a lot of background information here, and then we're going to talk a little bit about San Francisco, and hopefully between the two of those primers, we'll be pretty caught up, and then we'll dig into a couple chapters of what we would write in this book. So first, I want to start off by acknowledging that queer people have always existed and everywhere, not just in San Francisco. We can actually look at what a lot of researchers are saying about how non-heterosexuality shows up in the human population. It arrives at around 10%. And that's a statistically significant number because what most biologists would say is that when you see something showing up in about 10% of a population, it means that it's an advantageous trait. We see that also left-handedness is about 10%. We see extremely short and tall people at about 10%, colorblindness at 10%. So we know that this is useful to humanity, and there's a lot of theories about why it is. Some people have argued that, well, maybe this is a group of people who aren't procreating, but they're also helping raise kids, right? So you're getting extra support for parents. More recently, people have argued that, well, actually, this might be really advantageous whenever there's spousal abuse or there's some kind of victim situation. You have gay people who are more likely to run to your rescue or help you in some situation. So lots of theories out there as to why, but we can say with certainty that this is true, that homosexuality is absolutely an advantageous thing to the human race. Now, when we look into history, we can go back to the beginning of civilization and see that even in ancient Egypt and India, deities and spirits transform fluidly between male and female and third genders, often taking lovers in each form. We know that in ancient Chinese and Greek aristocracy, they took on same-sex lovers as a status symbol. And we know that also in ancient Zapotecs in Central America defined the existence of a third gender that is still respected in modern Mexico today. Africa was home to many openly gay, bisexual, and transgender rulers throughout history. And it was European colonialism that really imposed most of today's homophobic attitudes on the continent. One example is Kabaka Mwanga II on the right there, who was a bisexual ruler targeted by English colonial propaganda, which used his bisexuality as proof of, quote, African barbarism. And so we see that the attitudes towards queerness has really changed through the years. And unfortunately, and unsurprisingly, a lot of blame continues to lay at the feet of colonization, having changed a lot of those attitudes around the world. Now, Speaking of colonization in the West, there was really a big shift around the Industrial Revolution. Most scholars put modern gay identity around the Victorian era. And part of that was because during the Industrial Revolution, cities grew really fast. And what grew along with them? The red light districts often grew as well. And what would happen pretty regularly was this phenomenon that elites of the day would go down and they would use the services of some of those gay male sex workers. And those sex workers in exchange would often extort them in order to get ahead, maybe some money or some privilege. Not a lot of ways to survive in Victorian society or get ahead, so more power to them. But what started to frustrate the lords and elites who were trying to prosecute and arrest some of these sex workers, what was frustrating them was that the laws in the books were from the 1500s. They were too old, too vague. They didn't really make any sense anymore. And so around the 1860s, we see a wave of new, quote, anti-sodomy laws that begin to spring up in both England and in Germany. Now, luckily by then, we'd already had some early gay rights advocates. 1867, we see Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, and he's a writer in Berlin, and he's writing essays and writing into papers, and he's saying that, hey, homosexuality isn't one of these aberrant behaviors. It isn't a random act. It is the way some people are born. So Lady Gaga's Born This Way lyrics are 150 years old, right? These arguments are actually going way farther back than most of us probably realize. We also have, towards the end of the 1800s, other kinds of queer writers, playwrights, artists, and they're all using kind of queer-coded, that's tough to say, queer-coded imagery in a lot of their work. You see certain kinds of symbols like the color lavender show up in a lot of things. In fact, even Abraham Lincoln wrote in his journal, "I might have a lavender streak in me," which is his way of acknowledging that he might be a little bit bi. And so we see that art is starting to become a way of transferring some of this knowledge, and that people in the know are able to kind of understand some of these symbols as they see them. Another great writer, Oscar Wilde, who probably most famous of all, was incarcerated for being gay. That incarceration very likely led to his eventual death. But he toured all over the world, and he had a symbol of his own. It was a green carnation that he wore in his lapel. And it was a symbol that was adopted by dandies all throughout America and Europe who would do the same thing, so that at a bar you could kind of tell who's playing for the same team from across the way. It's something that Elliot Page recently paid homage to on a red carpet event recently, a nod to some of these very early gay symbols that predate the rainbow flag by decades. Oscar Wilde actually came to San Francisco, and when he did, this was our tribute to him in a political cartoon. I love that even 100 years later, Oscar looks very swishy to this day, and you can still tell what they were trying to say here. Now, they made fun of a lot of his eccentric dress by Wild West San Francisco standards. He was pretty eccentric. He went out and drank a lot with the Bohemian Club, the very secretive Bohemian Club. And then was also described, he gave a lecture right over here on Montgomery Street in a hall that's long been torn down. But the newspapers covered him, and they described him as having a, quote, dreaded effeminacy, which I think is the most punk band name you could ever come up with. So I'm offering that for free to you. Another badass of this era is Magnus Hirschfeld, who we see being the daddy here in this photo. He really was an early researcher who coined a lot of terminology that we still use today, and his study of human sexuality founded an entire research institute in Berlin. He studied a lot about human sexuality, including the idea that there was an infinite number of genders. And so really pushing the envelope in a lot of different ways. Now, his writing on and views on kind of gender identity, and especially things like masculinity, were particularly threatening to the Nazis. And so when they came to power, his books were the very first ones they burned. Okay, so that gets us a little bit up to speed on some background for LGBT history. Let's talk a little bit about San Francisco, and my favorite nickname for it, Queen City of the West. Now, there's a couple things that made San Francisco pretty ideal for becoming America's gay capital. One is geography. We can see that of all of the different capitals that at one point or another tried to directly or indirectly control San Francisco, it's pretty far away from all of them. And that from the very beginning gives San Francisco a certain reputation. If you're an outlaw or a rebel or just gay and don't want to have to settle down like everyone expects you to, San Francisco immediately has some advantages here. We also see a bit of the geography in terms of our bay. The shallow bay that we enjoy was a great safe harbor for ships. It winds up contributing to the economic power of San Francisco. And many people forget because now we have LA is a little bigger than San Francisco. But San Francisco for centuries really was the dominant economic force on the West Coast and would have drawn tons of people here as well. The other geographic factor here is that as World War II broke out, it's a strategic position for a lot of the Allied ships that would go into the Pacific theater. And so thousands of servicemen coming through San Francisco on their way to fight in that war. And many of them returning home, especially if they were outed and discharged during service. Another contributing factor here is diversity. Early San Francisco especially looks very different from other American cities. We can see just a small smattering of the representation we would have had here. And as a result, San Francisco becomes known as a wide open town. It's a place where almost anything goes. It's where you are far from home, where you are dependent on people who have different languages, religions, identities, and you're dependent on them in order to make this work and to survive. And so San Francisco becomes unique right from the beginning and a part of its DNA. Another part of San Francisco is culture. San Francisco's culture and eventually notoriety as a place of basically a party town makes it quite an ideal spot to begin to develop, especially gay bar culture that would come in the decades to follow, centuries to follow. We also know that early San Francisco was called a city of bachelors. According to the census, even about 90% of San Francisco was male up until around 1900. It shaped a lot about San Francisco, including the fact that things like hanky code could have possibly originated around this era when men needed a way and a system to be able to coordinate their dances and decide who was going to take the male or the female role in these very gendered dances back then. This also, in terms of culture, shapes a lot of the way that we are celebrating and entertaining ourselves. In fact, in 1866, there are 31 saloons for every one place of worship in San Francisco. Shapes quite a bit of the culture. By the 1890s, this becomes even more exaggerated, and we know that we had enough capacity for every man, woman, and child in San Francisco to go out and drink at the same time if they wanted to. That is more than double the capacity of Chicago or New York at the same time, and they were much bigger cities. So it's hard to overstate the influence that drinking really had in early San Francisco and the partying mentality that really shaped and made it ideal for eventually gay bars to come along later on. Now, by prohibition, which San Francisco tried its best to ignore, it does have a couple consequences. It does end the saloon era, and so those big halls that you've seen in Westerns, they do start to close. And in their place, there's smaller speakeasies and then smaller bars. And what's nice about these niche bars is that they are often themed. Sometimes it's a classical music theme, or sometimes it's about a certain kind of drink. And eventually we see gay bars emerge as well, a smaller community that's a little safer where people can come out, reveal who they are, and then find like kind and share community in that way. One of these important bars was the Black Cat Cafe, just a couple blocks from here. It won a really important case in 1953 where it was able to overturn a ruling that had tried to take away its liquor license, which the only grounds for that were that it was serving known homosexuals. Well, they fought it and eventually got that overturned. It was one of the earliest landmark victories for gay rights. And it also essentially legitimized the idea of a gay bar. The judge said there's no law that says that gays can't congregate and that someone serving liquor, if they know they're gay, is prohibited in any way from serving them such. So this may make the Black Cat Cafe maybe the first legally recognized gay bar in San Francisco, and San Francisco home to it as well. All right, so now we have a little bit of background on both those things. Let's write our queer history textbook here. So I'm going to go chapter by chapter here, how I think this might be written based on some of the research that I've done. As we go through, I'll try to call out some of the people. One of the great things about doing the walking tour is that I get a chance to meet a lot of people who fill in the gaps, share more stories. So I'll try to pepper this with some personal anecdotes that I've heard from some special people along the way here. So first we have to start with the Ohlone in the Spanish. I showed just a little glimpse of the Ohlone on one of those slides earlier, but we have to talk about how for millennia, long before white colonization, the Ohlone lived here and without the interference of people, of homophobia and people trying to interject their own belief systems. The Ohlone being a diverse group of different tribes all with a shared language. And we have some notion of what their attitudes toward queerness were, because when the Spanish did arrive in the 1700s, they kept pretty detailed notes of their encounters. So one of those was by a man named Friar Francisco Palau. He wrote around 1787, and he says here, "The father missionaries of the mission noticed among the Gentile women who always worked separately and without mixing with the men, there was one who had all the appearances of a woman, but he must be a man." So the Spanish, despite having traveled all around the world, were very confused by gender nonconforming behavior. And so they asked the Ohlone, they say, "What's going on here?" And the Ohlone say, "Oh, it's not a big deal. This is called a coilla." You're going to see coillas in every village. They coexist. It's not a big deal. Sometimes they date each other. Sometimes they participate in the women's work or the men's work, and it's not a big deal. Well, to the Spanish, this was a very big deal, right? They're here to enforce their belief systems on the people who are living here. And so the story goes, according to this friar, that they take this coilla, they strip them out of their clothing, and they try to prove in front of everyone at the mission what their true gender identity is. Really humiliating. So not long after, the coillas stopped coming by the missions, and the Spanish go out looking for them. And Francisco Palau's next account is that they go into one of these villages, they pull a coilla couple out of their bedroom, strip them down in front of everyone, and beat them in front of their friends and family, trying to punish them and show what they think of this behavior. It's really terrible to see this kind of event happen on our soil that we now know has many more chapters to the gay history and the access of gay rights on the same parcel that we're standing on, really. But we know that the coillas, not long after this incident, basically disappear. Friar Francisco Palau says, "After the punishments of the coillas received, they were not seen again in the mission, nor in any place nearby, nor have any such execrable people been found since in any of the missions. Only they say that in the stretch of land along the channel of Santa Barbara, there are to be found many coillas." So Santa Barbara might be California's first neighborhood. But these findings are really fascinating, and they reveal quite a bit, not just of a tragic story and some really awful behavior on the part of the Spanish here, but also they teach us a little bit about what's the importance of queer community. We see that this need to remove themselves from the missions and from their villages and to build their own village was a really essential part, not just to escape violence and abuse, but also to escape judgment as well. And so the coillas teach us right away what some of the value of community is. Chapter 2, we have to talk about gays in the military. Now, especially World War II played a huge role in San Francisco's development, and especially gay members of the military during this period. So we know that in 1941, the Pentagon is formed. The United States has never been more powerful militarily, and it is trying to shore up a lot of its ranks and formalize a lot of its policies. One of these policies it wants to make sure everyone's on the same page about is the stance of gays in the military. Now, up until around this time, the policy had been that gay acts were bad and they could get you court-martialed and eventually potentially even ejected from the military. But what changes here is that in 1941, the Pentagon seeks out the advice of psychologists who by this time have caught up to Karl Heinrich Ulrichs way back in 1860s Berlin. And they say the same thing. They say that homosexuality isn't random acts, it's the way some people are born. So the Pentagon dutifully copies those notes, and that's what their policy says. No gay people are allowed in the military. Now, what's extraordinary about that is that they have subtly kind of made a progressive statement here, and what they've acknowledged to people all across America is that there aren't gay acts, that this is an actual identity. And so even though it's a discriminatory policy, there is some kind of silver lining in this policy that they make. Now, regardless, like I said, it's overwhelmingly a negative thing, and so we start to see some queer resistance form, largely in reaction to the federal government's policies at this time. Two groups that formed, the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society. Daughters of Bilitis starting here in San Francisco with Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, and the Mattachine Society starting first in LA and then moving up here to San Francisco. But both were quite vocal and copied quite a bit from the Black civil rights movement, a lot of strategies in order to protest, especially some of the government policies. The Mattachine Society had its own review, and the Daughters of Bilitis had the latter. But in the Mattachine Society, they wrote a response to this. They said, thousands of graves in France, many, many thousands more graves in South Pacific islands and beneath the seas, contain the sad remains of men who were brave soldiers, airmen, sailors, and Marines first, and homosexuals second. They were no less brave, they did no less to win the war for democracy than did their heterosexual compatriots. But the democracy for which they did fight and die, and still fight and still die, and will yet fight and yet die, denies them and us our rights. Now, members who were thrown out of the military would be given what was called a blue discharge. This was considered neither honorable nor dishonorable, but it still had a lot of consequences, and it was also irrefutable. You could not contest this charge if it was given to you. So the blue discharges were pretty damaging. One person who received one of these blue discharges as a young Harvey Milk here, fighting in the Korean War, World War II, but nonetheless, it really radicalized him and stayed with him as an important point in the rest of his life. Now, what was interesting about some of these discharges is that they would wind up coming back to San Francisco, especially if they had been in the later part of the war and World War II and been on the Pacific Theater. And oftentimes, rather than go home and explain to their friends or family what had happened, it was easier sometimes to just stay in San Francisco and make a new life. And because it made it harder sometimes to buy a house or to get a job, having that on your record, many of them became entrepreneurs. Many of them relied on SROs here in the Tenderloin and Polk Street areas in order to get through. All the way through Vietnam, we have strange tension of our country compelling gay members to service, but also compelling them to silence about who they are. Chapter 3, we would have to talk about the rise of this queer resistance. Post-World War II, we see a huge, really a sliding backwards progressively for America. Senator Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn pictured here as part of their witch hunts, trying to root out not un-American activities. J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI was also spreading a lot of propaganda, all of them really trying to conjure up this false moral panic in America to make them scared of gay people. What they were arguing was that America's so far tolerance of gay people had made it weaker in the fight against communism. If you can imagine such an argument. And as part of this, they designed a lot of falsehoods, including things like gay bars are just dens for drugs, and gay people are trying to groom children and recruit them into their ranks. Sadly, things you still hear sometimes from time to time from conservative talking points. I did get a chance to talk to a man, Tom Baker. He was about 93. I talked to him a couple of years ago. That's when I met him. He remembered coming to North Beach around this time in the 1950s and going to some of these gay bars. His favorite was Gordon's. And he talked about the exhilaration of the very first time coming to a gay bar. It was a terrifying time to do so. And he was, as excited as he was also very scared. He said that the adrenaline was going through him, and eventually the anxiety, and eventually he had an attack, and he had to step outside, and he vomited on the sidewalk. He was so nervous. I mean, imagine a time that you were so scared just to go inside of a bar and see other people, a time that should be happy when you're seeing other people like yourself and feeling community. And this is the overwhelming feeling, is that you're actually just terrified the police will come in and attack you, perhaps arrest you, perhaps force you to lose your job. He eventually did lose his job at an airline because he was gay around this time. Now, around this time as well, we have Del Martin and Phyllis Line, who I said started the Daughters of Bilitis. And they saw this scene in North Beach and said, you know what, this is entertainment, but it is not community. They saw a lot of straight people opening nightclubs, making money to other straight tourists coming in, and they were really making money off of this gender-bending entertainment. Queer people saw something of themselves and would go for a different reason. But they were altogether not satisfied. They said, we need to get more organized. We need to fight some of this police abuse and the raids. And so they created their own kind of activist organizations. By the early 60s, we have heroes like Jose Sarria, who would become the first openly gay candidate for office a full 16 years ahead of Harvey Milk, at least his successful run. Today we have, an airport terminal and a school and a community center named after Harvey Milk, as we should. And yet so few tributes to Jose Sarria, who came more than a decade before and pioneered quite a bit of the path for others. With other heroes like Felicia Flames, who took the Greyhound bus up from San Jose with her friend, arrived in the Tenderloin, and said she found Oz. That this was an amazing and inspiring place where there was basically a ready-made classroom. Other trans women and drag queens taught Felicia how to do their makeup, how to defend themselves from dangerous Johns, and how to avoid the police, who would often graft and extort people walking around the Tenderloin. By the mid-60s, 1964, June to be specific, Life magazine is the one who finally crowned San Francisco America's gay capital. And they run this giant spread. You could call it maybe an expose or a feature, depending on how you want to look at it. But you have to remember, this is a time when Life magazine is in a quarter of America's homes. So this really introduces quite a bit of people to this San Francisco and this mecca for all these queer people. We see pictured here the toolbox down in Soma, a leather bar. Don't go looking for it. It's a Whole Foods now. And then also mentioned in the article is the Jumping Frog, a Tenderloin gay bar. But both of these basically signal to queer people all over America that there is a place for them, and they start coming in droves. Thousands of young people coming to the Tenderloin and Polk Street areas, often landing in some of those SROs as a way of getting started and beginning to build community together. And those young people would really kick off our next chapter, which was gay liberation. So we'll start with the rest of 1964. At the end of that year, there's a big event. This is actually one of the last big moments of the homophile groups. The Daughters of Bilitis in particular reach out to a bunch of other gay groups, and they also reach out to some ministers unexpectedly, and they create what's called the Council for Religion and the Homosexual, and they decide that they're going to offer up a dance, a ball, a way of kind of bringing these two groups together. And so what they do is they rent out California Hall, and they are going to throw this New Year's Eve party. The priests go and talk to the police, because at the time you needed their permission in order to throw a dance. They get all the permits they need, and despite jumping through all the hoops, the police show up with photographers trying to intimidate people. They show up with wagons, handcuffs, and one by one begin to sneak into this event until eventually they do raid the place and make several arrests. Now, there's amazing stories from this moment, including that the priests wanted to be arrested along with it, but weren't allowed by the organizers. They said, we need your hands clean. You need to talk about this tomorrow. There's stories of ministers putting drag queens under their robes and smuggling them into limousines to get them out of the event before the police attack. And the next day, the ministers held up their part of the bargain, and they lambasted the SFPD and explained the whole story of everything they'd been through. Many of the ministers compared that night to Selma, and they had been there in some of those marches, and they said this was completely uncalled for, that the groups had done nothing wrong. They were enjoying a party like any other New Year's Eve party across the city. And it really was the beginning of a turning point in San Francisco. This is the first time that newspapers start to use the word homosexual instead of deviant. And because it's a moral figure like church leadership that's making these claims, it really does begin to move public opinion as well. Another important group about a year or two later here in the Tenderloin is Vanguard. Vanguard is a group mostly of youths who in the Tenderloin who are trying to put together a lot of things that they need. They see the state is not giving them what they need, and so they're going to organize it for themselves. So Vanguard has 5 goals when they start off. They say we need a community coffee house, a third place that we can exist. We need a format for police mediation so that we can report abuses. We need emergency housing. We need a VD clinic, and we need employment counseling. They managed to achieve all 5 of those goals in their very first year of existence, which is pretty amazing. The coffee house they created still operates today as Hospitality House on Turk, providing a lot more than coffee and a lot of great services to the community. This is a statement, excerpt from their statement of purpose. They said, Vanguard is an organization for the youth in the Tenderloin attempting to get for its citizens a sense of dignity and responsibility so long denied. We find our civil liberties imperiled by a hostile social order in which all difference from the usual in behavior is attacked. We have finally realized we can only change these processes through the strength we develop for ourselves through our own efforts. Now, Vanguard would do a lot of great things. What we saw in the previous slide was their famous sweep-in, where they are mocking all of the police sweeps on the streets of the Tenderloin. And so they have these giant oversized brooms, and they're doing it in bouffant hairdos and sunglasses at night. And mocking really a lot of the policies of San Francisco at the time. Now, what they would also do is stage some boycotts. One of those places, because a coffee house was so important, they were staging boycotts of a diner called Compton's Cafeteria, which had recently grown quite hostile towards a lot of the drag queens who'd go and visit there because the city was trying to purge a lot of the neighborhood in an effort to revitalize, quote unquote, as part of these urban renewal projects. And this is actually one of the few pictures we actually have of the queens inside Compton's Cafeteria. But it's one night that perhaps, hopefully most of you are now familiar with this story. It's one night that the police come in to harass the drag queens, and they go too far. Someone snaps, they throw their coffee in the officer's face, and with that, cups and bowls and spoons and plates and everything else go flying at these officers. Stories of queens using their high-heeled shoes, of their heavy purses, all to beat the police out of the diner and send them running down the street in fear. It is quite a turning point in terms of the relationship between the police and a lot of the trans members of the Tenderloin community, and is often compared to as San Francisco's Stonewall. Now, the reason we wouldn't call it, the reason why most of us had to learn about this a little probably after Stonewall, is because Stonewall got national media attention when it happened, and Compton's didn't even get local press coverage. It's hard to even find any articles talking about it when it happened. We rely a lot on anecdotes and oral stories. Now, in '69, just a few months after Stonewall, San Francisco had another big event. This was often called Friday of the Purple Hand. This was a protest against a lot of the local media that was covering the gay community really negatively. You see here the headline, "The Dreary Revels of SF Gay Clubs," where they're making a lot of fun of what one reporter's going out and trying to make fun of a lot of the clubs he goes to. So they go and they protest outside. They picket outside the examiner's office, and the newspaper employees take magenta ink and dump it out the windows onto the protesters. Without missing a beat, they take that ink, they smear it all over their hands, and they're putting handprints on the building. They're writing "F the examiner," they're writing "gay power," and making a protest even out of the ink that they've been given. My favorite report from this described the event. They said, a transvestite clunked a pig over the head with the picket sign he was carrying. A pole broke, and the dazed officer looked shocked as he watched him escape, running as fast as he could in his tight skirt, his high-heeled shoes clicking like a typewriter as he ran down the sidewalk. Now, the year after Stonewall here in San Francisco, there was a big commemoration for the one-year anniversary of that riot, and the decision and coordination with New York was to do a parade. And where would it be? Down Polk Street, because that's where most of our gay bars were at the time. And so a small group of 20 or 30 people start all the way up at the Aquatic Center, and they would walk all the way down to City Hall. This would, just in a few years, become an enormous celebration, attracting hundreds of thousands of people and having to move over to Market Street eventually just to contain the swells of people here. 70s Polk Street sounds like a blast. If I could go to any time period, that is where I would choose 100%. And not only is it the home of disco, but you can see here just how many queer spaces I've been able to identify so far, at least 158. That might make this the densest concentration of gay bars anywhere in the world. Not all of them open at the same time, of course, but many of them overlapping, especially in the 1970s. Today, sadly, only 2 of these spaces exist anymore. We have the Cinch on Polk Street and Aunt Charlie's over in the Tenderloin. I did get a chance to talk to there's one person who does remember the 70s. This is JD. He went on my tour, and then afterwards I got him some Italian food. And he was reminiscing about his favorite bars, like the Capri over in North Beach, which he was still going to well into the 70s, along with a lot of his hippie friends. And they would often complain about the homophile groups. By this point in the 1970s, the homophiles are starting to fall apart, and it's the younger gay liberation movement that's leading the charge and going forward with a lot more direct action in order to get the results they're after. Speaking of controversy, we direct action, we have to mention Reverend Ray Shears, quite a character here. Reverend Ray Shears, if you haven't heard of him, I encourage you to look it up when you get home. He's an amazing character. He is an evangelical preacher who comes to San Francisco and is also a gay rights activist. And one day after he is leaving one of his institutions in the Tenderloin, he is gay bashed by a group of people in 1973. He decides a couple days later he's going to host a press conference, and this is that press conference, him in a minister's collar and 2 rifles, announcing the formation of the Lavender Panthers. This is a vigilante group that will now patrol both Polk Street and the Castro to defend gay people in a way that the police have not been doing successfully. Now, this burns a lot of bridges. As you can probably guess, this is not what the gay rights activists at the time are going for. This is not the image they want in newspapers around the country. And unfortunately, it creates a rift between the 2 different movements here in the city. But Ray Shears was quite adamant about the need for better protection. And this was punctuated by an event that happened the same year that Harvey Milk won his election. In 1977, a young man, Robert Hillsborough, was with his boyfriend leaving a bar here in San Francisco. Robert was just a couple years younger than me. And they noticed some guys following them. They jump in their car. Those guys follow them. And they drive to their home, which was around where the Lexington used to be, where Wild Hawk is today. And they jump out of their car. His boyfriend makes it over a fence, but Robert gets pulled back down. And the men beat him up. And not only that, one of them eventually pulls a knife. And he says, "This is for Anita Bryant." And he stabs him 15 times in the chest and face. So this horrific violence happening just inside San Francisco, just a couple blocks from the Castro, the same year that Harvey Milk is getting elected, really illustrates the need that Ray Brochures was talking about, that there's still real danger. It also further illustrates what many people had been saying for a long time, that rhetoric from people like Anita Bryant and other kind of national figures has real consequences and can lead to real violence. And this, unfortunately, was the way a lot of people wound up finding proof. On a lighter note, in 1977, this is Ben. He came on my tour. We chatted a little bit afterwards. And this is the same year that he met his longtime boyfriend over at the Rendezvous on Polk. Ben shared a lot of really interesting perspectives. He talked about how he preferred the scene on Polk Street a lot more than the Castro, because oftentimes at the Castro, people of color expected to get double ID'd in order to get into some of those bars. And even if they did get in, a lot of times they faced either just rude ignorance from white people who were there, or sometimes even just being shouted at or abused, sometimes attending some of these bars. And so they greatly preferred the community that was still thriving on Polk Street at the time. It's important to remember that the intersectionality that still exists here, that even though one group is finding a community in a safe space, it does not necessarily mean it was safe for everyone else. Now, a few years after Harvey Milk, unfortunately, we know, of course, also ending in violence with his assassination and Mayor Moscone, we have to jump ahead to the jury verdict, which accepted Dan White's ridiculous Twinkie defense, which is what his lawyers used. They said that he had too many sweets the day before his double homicide, and that's what made his brain race and commit those awful murders. And this was sadly accepted. He got a pretty lenient sentence for it and was released out of prison after just 5 years. The gays who normally were doing peaceful protests have reached a limit. And as part of this White Night riot in 1979, they go down Market Street setting cop cars on fire. My favorite story from this is that one of them, while they're about to set one of the cars on fire, turns to a reporter and says, "Make sure you tell them I had too many Twinkies today." In the aftermath of the White Night riots, the police retaliated. They marched on the Castro. They beat people on the sidewalk indiscriminately. They raid a bar right at the corner of Castro and 18th. And not only with several arrests, commit several injuries as well until they're called off. The next morning, the reporters had the audacity to ask if gay people should apologize for the riot. And it was Milk's replacement, Harry Britt, who said, "Harvey Milk's people do not have anything to apologize for. Now society is going to have to deal with this not as nice little fairies who have hairdressing salons, but as people capable of violence. We're not going to put up with Dan Whites anymore." All right, in our fifth chapter here, about a community really in crisis. Like I said, today, a lot of questions about what the community is going to hold on to and persist, how things might evolve. But we also should talk about its initial part of this chapter, which is really the AIDS crisis. Never a fun topic to talk about, but really important to understanding the story here. For some of us, we may have lived through AIDS and remember it, but for younger people who go on my tours, they're often very unfamiliar with it. So it is way past due that we be chronicling this and sharing this story and repeating it from the very beginning so that everyone knows what happened here. So the AIDS crisis, while it could have started as early as the 70s, was definitely a pandemic by the 80s. And what's amazing about this is that, we can know that millions of people have died from this disease. We can know that up to 10% of all gay people died from this disease. But when you start to look at the statistics of how it affected communities, it's really quite overwhelming. In San Francisco, the one I've highlighted here, in 1990, for all men between 25 and 44, 61% of that community passed away from AIDS. Now, that's not only a terrible human loss, that is a community killer. That is part of what led to the decline of Polk Street and a lot of the bars there. It's what really threatens traditions from being able to be passed on between people. This is really a total loss in many regards. And you see many other cities experiencing similar tragedies across the country. Psychologists who just a couple decades earlier were listing homosexuality as a mental disturbance and were recommending electroshock therapy. We're now helping gay people cope, inventing terms like multiple loss syndrome, which would help people understand how after they spent months sitting by a partner who passed away, they now return to a friend group who had also lost many people as well. I had the opportunity to meet Marcia, who came on my tour. She shared with me her love of singing. She joined the lesbian and gay chorus of San Francisco and sang in it for many years at many of the recitals. But she had to drop out, not because she lost her voice or grew tired of singing, But when the AIDS crisis struck and they started doing funerals, she said she couldn't make it through a single one without crying. Her heart was still in so much of the storytelling, and she choked up even just telling me about these times, seeing just a small pamphlet here from one of the recitals. But Marsha's story reminds me of the sacrifice that many other lesbians were doing for the gay community as well. Despite decades of misogyny against the lesbian community, they were turning the other cheek and helping gay people try to survive as best they could, oftentimes showing up in their hospitals or marching on the streets for them to help protect their rights. This is also when we see activists like Cleve Jones put together projects like the AIDS Quilt, trying to draw national attention to the crisis and alert the public to the lack of action from the federal government. It was organizations like ACT UP here in San Francisco that led a giant march on October 12th from 1989 down from the federal building to the corner of Castro and Market. When they got there, they staged a die-in, and they would do chalk outlines of people on the street to draw attention to the fatality of this crisis. When one of the protesters knocked over a parked police motorcycle, it is when 200 officers moved in and began to attack and arrest people on the street. That led to at least 53 arrests, and it injured more than a dozen. The city later having to pay out more than $200,000 to the victims in a settlement later on. So this is it. This is San Francisco's kind of, in a broad sweep, its journey here. And really, even though the AIDS crisis is probably the closest in history a textbook would ever go back, it's definitely not the end of a crisis we can be talking about in terms of the next topics people are going to be asking about. I talk to young people and they question the need for gay bars, whether or not we need these defined spaces that are distinctly queer. And there's a lot of other distractions and other issues that are now entering the docket that people want to talk about and drive the agenda towards, that are all part of this discussion. All right, we did it. We did our whole textbook in 45 minutes, which is pretty good. I'm going to leave you with some final thoughts here. When I started this project, I was struck by a euphemism that the Victorians used about homosexuality. They called it that unspeakable vice of the Greeks. It resonated with me because I came out in the state of Florida, whose legislature has been obsessed with don't say gay efforts that attempt to silence and erase any mention of gay history or identity. The ability just to talk about who we are is at the heart of our historical and present day battles. Whether it was the whispers of brave Kauias finding a new village for themselves, or the belting of drag queens on North Beach tables, or the trembling voices of Felicia Flames, JD, Ben, Tom, Marsha, or myself, who came out to people and risked alienation, or the Castro riots of folks who got out of the bars and into the streets chanting that silence equals death. How San Francisco became America's gay capital was through the strength of our fabulous, defiant, and wonderfully gay voices who took an unspeakable vice and gave it a voice. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's talk.
Well, thank you. Let me make one mention, and that's the fact that if you want to share this with friends or people who may not be sympathetic, this is all going to be online. It'll be available a week, 3 days, 4 days, and you just simply go to the Historical Society's website, and you can download it, and you can watch it at home. So we did not mention that. I wanted to mention that for sure. All right. The way this works is I look for you to make eye contact or whatever. Let me know you want a question, and then we'll pick. We have one person in the back, one person in the front. We have our one question already ready to be asked. And then Shawn will take the questions, and I will just organize, make sure that we don't bump into each other. All right? Let's go.
Hi, Shawn. First of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Regarding Harvey Milk, of course, in this brief presentation, you went in just to his assassination and the White Night riots. As someone in my 20s who lived on the East Coast in the 70s, I moved here largely because of Harvey Milk, because as a political science major at university, I couldn't fathom the idea of a city that elected a gay man. And to me, and I know hundreds of people were coming in by the day at that time in the late 70s. I wonder if you could speak to that a bit.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a fair assessment. There's a bit of a neglect in that presentation of Harvey Milk, mostly because I think that's all I knew about San Francisco when I came here, and because there's a popular movie, and because most people on the tour tend to already know that story. I tend to already be focused on some other parts of it. But you're absolutely right. I shouldn't in any way demean or fail to give the right attention that's due to Harvey Milk, who really did show tremendous leadership for the community there. Yeah, it's interesting too. There were a lot of other people who supported and worked with Harvey Milk who built a whole machine really out of the Castro, including Sally Gerhardt, who unfortunately gets not mentioned enough and not mentioned at all in the movie, and who did amazing work feeding even some of his best lines to him, but going with him on the campaign against the Briggs Initiative, and doing a lot to kind of explain to people, certainly in California, but across the country as well. What exactly it was they were fighting for, and trying to articulate a little bit more of what freedoms were at stake for them. Talking about all of Harvey Milk is tough because there's so many biographies written that I could be here all night, but happy to elaborate too if there's something specific or a period or anything in particular. Yeah.
If it comes off very often on your tours or any other ways about people talking about Harvey before he was assassinated, became a martyr, Harvey the man.
Yeah, Harvey hasn't come up as much as a question. You know what's interesting about the tours I do, because it's a North Beach tour and a Tenderloin and Polk Street one, I tend to get people looking a little bit more for like a 201 class. So people who want to learn about Harvey Milk tend to end up going on one of the great tours in the Castro, where they go by his camera shop and they spend a majority of the tour talking about his legacy. When we get to my tours, I tend to focus a little bit more on Jose Sarria, who came before him, a little more on the Polk Street scene. We do talk about, as we go by City Hall, of course, a lot of his speeches, and of course the White Night riots, as we talked about tonight, and stuff that go there. But to answer your question, I don't get too many questions about Harvey Milk, just by the nature of the fact that I tend to explain that we're focused on some other people in the story.
Another question or comment?
Thank you. I have a question about Polk Street and Castro. When did the shift happen that gay people started moving to the Castro and the bars and abandoning the Polk or leaving Polk Street to the sex workers, the people of color?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I won't commit to a specific date, but I would say that there's a couple of things I've read that kind of suggest what was starting to happen. Part of that is we know that there were urban renewal projects, even with the Muni line being built over in Market Street, pushing a lot of people across Turk toward Polk Street. Polk Street already had a lot of gay-owned businesses, and we do know that they had formed basically a coalition and a lobby of other business owners, and they were lobbying City Hall to start doing sweeps on Polk Street. Sadly, you have this moment in time where we have gay, white, and probably white business owners calling the police on trans sex workers who had been pushed out of the Tenderloin. And it's not long after that we begin to see them migrating towards the Castro. So, if I'm reading between the lines or inferring between those events, perhaps that's what was going through their heads, is they wanted a different space if they were frustrated with police sweeps or what they thought the neighborhood should be like. The gradual kind of move to the Castro, though, took at least a decade or so, though. It was, the peak was the late 70s for a lot of the bars as I've documented them, but by the mid 80s, most of those had closed, and certainly by the 2000s, almost none of them were left.
You have a question in the back?
I had a question. I moved here in 1975 from Los Angeles, and between 75 and about 1982, there were specific areas where queers went. Castro was the flannel shirt, hankies, and Levi's. The Polk was, a lot of other people. The Tenderloin were transvestites, transgenders, and people like that. So my opinion is that it was and then South of Market was like S&M and the leather crowd. So I think it was very segregated, and that's just one of my comments. And another comment is that I noticed a lot of discrimination. If I wanted to bring a woman into a gay bar on Castro, in the 70s, they would really hassle you. And if I wanted to go into a lesbian bar, it was the same way. They just did not want the other gender at the bar.
About the question over here.
I don't have an exact question, but just changes in like society and the way that we exist. I've noticed that there's a lot less drinking in general with like the younger populations. And I heard you say earlier, like, do we need gay bars anymore? I think we obviously need gay spaces and like queer spaces and trans spaces and whatnot. But with the changes in participation with things like alcohol, what are your like thoughts on that and like possible changes we might see in the way that these types of things exist?
Yeah, totally. That's a great point. I often point it out too. There's a stat I talk about on the end of the North Beach tour where it's something like, I think since 2007, America's lost 50% of its gay bars. And most people hear that and the wind goes out of them. But when you actually take into consideration what you're saying, that like, actually, we're also seeing an evolution here as well. It's not just decline. We're seeing more queer family friendly spaces. We're seeing more daytime things. We're seeing more coffee shops. There was a great article, I think I want to say it was in the New Yorker or something a couple of years ago, about all these great shops opening in Brooklyn that are offering more kind of like community oriented alternatives to bars. So I totally agree. It doesn't have to be alcohol centric. It has been traditionally, and so I think people are kind of attached to that format. But I'm excited to see what people come up with as like a next evolution of a lot of these spaces, as long as they continue to be spaces. My biggest fear is that people substitute something digital or artificial, and it never really has the same connection.
Question in the back.
Not really a question, 3 points. I have 3 points. I moved here to San Francisco in 1974, and shortly after that, I don't exactly remember what year it was Harvey Milk, who signed me up to become a registered voter in California, was standing outside the Safeway on the upper market, upper mission. And he had an ironing. And then you mentioned Tom Baker. Before you mentioned Paul.
Oh yeah, he's so great and so generous. He sat down with me for a couple afternoons as I recorded a testimony to give to the archive, and he also gave me a bunch of matchbooks that he saved from all these gay bars, which was really special. So some of them I'd never seen before, so it was cool to submit some new things to the archive. Tom's great. I didn't. You know what's always tricky about these is you have 10 hours of content and you have to get down to 45 minutes. And I think I barely made the 45 minutes, but yeah, hey, if you want to stay after, we can talk till the sun comes up about all the things I didn't get to mention. Yeah, that would be great.
Question on this side. Let me pass this over to you.
I was here at the time. We're talking like 80s when the police came in because they were upset at what was then the the Elephant Walk. I don't remember now what was the reaction with City Hall and the police. I mean, was there anything? Is anything that happened from that other than maybe punishment? And I'm not sure even that happened. But was there anything that actually came out of that for change?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'll answer it as best as I can, admitting that I have pretty spotty knowledge. This is actually something I'm researching more right now because I want to do eventually a third and final tour in the Castro, and I think it will focus mostly on these events. But to my knowledge, it was the police acting out a little bit, and I think it was even the chief of police, if I remember the story right, that actually was woken up and eventually got on the horn to call them all back out of the Castro. So from my recollection, this was not necessarily like a sanctioned thing. This was kind of the police being aggressive and taking matters into their own hands, so to speak. I'm not aware of any kind of public statement afterwards. There could have been. But like I said, I do know that there was eventually like a lawsuit and that the city did eventually settle with the victims of that sweep.
Question here.
Not really a question, but I do think Dianne Feinstein kind of took the bull by the horns, and she initiated, I believe, like a liaison between the gay community and the police department, and that there would be sensitivity training. I think Dianne Feinstein did initiate a lot of things as a result of that vandalizing the elephant walk.
Thank you. In addition to your comment, sir, that I moved here in 73, 74, worked at a bar on Polk Street for years. And so my experience of that time is pretty extensive. Going into the Castro, I remember people saying in the bar I worked in, it's so far away, and, at that time, people were spreading into their clone and their plaid shirts, their hammers and stuff. And people were buying up a lot of property where the big Victorians and the families that owned them moved to the suburbs. And these guys bought it and fixed it up. And I think economically, a lot of change was going up to the Castro area. But anyway, about the police, I just wanted to mention that with Dianne, after that attack by the police, which is sort of like a SFPD Proud Boys taking it on themselves. But then they started initiating gay teams and police baseball tournaments and games. And so there's a lot of outreach to the police, which I think we see as a result of that now, that we have so many gay and lesbian officers on the forces. And so there's been a lot of development from that terrible time. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks for sharing that.
So when you were mentioning the lavender scare, and like how a lot of the threads are kind of, similar, like, children grooming, etc. Like as a, historian, like, does there feel like there's new threads now in this kind of current era of, anti-gay, anti-trans, I don't know, reactionary, whatever?
Is your question more by new threads? Do you mean like, are there things they're doing differently this time around?
Differently, and like maybe like even talking points, that haven't really shown up before, and your thoughts on that, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I'll first say that it's always interesting. I found this strangely heartening doing the research for a lot of these tours, which is that you see periods of history where gay people have this unexpected visibility and progress, and you think things are going great, and then another decade where it all seems to go backwards. And something about noticing that was a kind of shifting pendulum somehow was comforting to know that, okay, I might be in one of these backward moments, but it does go back the other way again. Not to make me rest on laurels and not be active and still fight for things, or to lull myself into any kind of false sense of security, but at least to keep myself from being overwhelmed by the emotion of it. Sometimes it was helpful to see that pattern. In terms of what's being said nowadays, I mean, I think what's hard about even doing these tours is the vocabulary that had to come along the way. And so when you're talking about a neighborhood like North Beach in the 1930s, and there isn't really a vocabulary for transgender, certainly not well known enough for anyone on your tour to have identified as such, it's really tricky. And it goes also that like the people who were trying to spread a bunch of lies also didn't know the word transgender and things like that. So I would say what stands out most to me is just that the vocabulary has come a long way. We can be a lot more articulate about different kinds of identity, but we're seeing that being picked up immediately by the other side and also used in a way to kind of try and target people. So that's the only thing that jumps out to me from your question is just that I'm seeing different terminology to keep up with, and I'm seeing people probably be overly reactionary to new words as if they're hurting them. And instead of just learning them or being curious, they're trying to spread falsehoods about something new they just learned.
A question up front.
Shawn, a lot of history is written and told through the lens of heroes and coalitions. As you look to the future, who are the heroes and the coalitions that you're paying attention to protect what we've gained?
There's a great organization that is called Turk and Taylor, and they are trying to decarcerate the site of what was Compton's cafeteria. In fact, there's a lot of trans activism in general that I'm really inspired by here in San Francisco. And I think at a time when I'm on the sidelines lamenting about lack of community and where's the movement gone, I see a lot of strength in the trans community here in San Francisco. That initiative in particular is doing a lot to try and expose the fact that a private prison company now owns the site of Compton's cafeteria. So to add insult to injury, that it isn't even a proper homage to this historic event, it is also actively hurting the neighborhood and the people within it. So they're doing great work. They're trying to use some rules in the permitting to try and prevent them from being able to hold on to the building, and trying to raise money to be able to kind of buy it and change it into something that's more respectful and deserving of that memory. So there's no shortage of inspiring people out there. It's easy in history to look back, and I can summarize a whole year by one person's action. But we live in a time where it's harder to have that context. But if you look for it, you'll find no shortage of people in San Francisco trying to lead the way and herald another wave of our movement.
One last question.
You had mentioned how it's a challenge to tell a comprehensive story in such a brief compass. And I wonder if you might be willing to elaborate a little bit on some of the ways in which bars were an occasion for certain kinds of community organizing or community life. I'm thinking of examples like the Dash in the Barbary Coast or the Tavern Guild in the Tenderloin, if you might be willing to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. I wonder if you know more about the Dash than I do, because I only know a little bit. The Dash was in 1908, so right after the earthquake and fire, and is often cited as maybe the earliest gay bar in San Francisco. And I know that there were drag performers inside, so that's kind of astonishing to think of our great-grandparents seeing a drag performance in San Francisco in 1908. But to your larger question, gay bars were far more than, and to your earlier point earlier, far more than just a place to go get drunk. These were really where ties were being built and where bonds were being built. Also, because they were the victims of raids, this is where there was a lot of shared pain and grief and resilience between one another. You also had a lot of great events, like especially after the AIDS crisis, lots of examples of bars that would host potlucks, especially during the holidays, for people who maybe had lost loved ones, or who had just been, had lost their family, maybe in the process of coming out. And now this new community was using the bar as a physical venue to be able to support one another and still have some of that chosen family time together. Someone mentioned baseball teams. It was not that long ago that all of the bars used to have baseball teams, softball teams. I joined my first gay kickball league this spring. It was a lot of fun, but sadly, only one bar really sponsors most of it. I would love to see those come back to all of the bars so that they all have their own teams and there's a bit of fun and rivalry there. So, we say bars, and especially for people who maybe have a distaste for bars, that sounds like perhaps a negative place to start. But really, there's a huge extension of what that is, and that really encapsulates a real family and a community.
With that, we're going to close tonight's amazing program. Thank you, Shawn.
Thanks, everyone.